Okay, so I'm looking at this middle curve that has a bit of a swipe profile. You can see that the raw frames are not oriented in a way that would allow the robot to sweep along the curve. It would try to dive into the paper. So what we need to do is we need to decompose the perpendicular frames using this decomposed planes component. And what that does is it gives us the normal or perpendicular direction of each axis. Um, Once we have that, we can then use a rotate in 3D, uh, rotate planes or any object in 3D, depending on which axis we want to use for rotation. So this component gives us all three axes, and as well as the origin of the plane. This component allows us to then add degrees of rotation um, along one axis of the plane. So for example, if I turn these on and I move this slider, we can begin to see that now the ones that are turned in green are helping the robot flow along the curve in a much more oriented um, position relative to the curve. Okay. Now the last thing that we can do, so we're orienting around X or Y, and then we may actually want to turn the brush. These components are used to make sure that the planes are flipped so that the robot doesn't dive under the table. But then the last thing we can do is we can decide how we want to change the rotation of the brush as it's traveling along the curve, right? So those three things combined, first, the raw perpendicular frame components um, have to be decomposed into their respective axes. We need to select the right X or Y component of those axes, as well as the origin, and decide how we want to rotate that so that the robot is oriented correctly. And finally, we can rotate the Z axis of the brush. Once we have those things combined, then we can go back and simulate, and we can see that we have much better control of the brush as it floats or moves along this profile curve. So this is a very fundamental way of orienting planes along guide curves, and it's really switching from horizontal frames, which can just flow flat, to the three-dimensional control that we have by beginning with perpendicular frames, decomposing them, and then orienting them correctly by rotating them in space.